Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, coming to you from Washington, D.C. This is a rapid response discussion on the new package of Russia sanctions and other measures from the Biden administration out this morning on April 15th. Here to discuss what this new package entails, what it might mean for the future of the U.S.-Russia relationship. I'm joined by a dream team of colleagues from Washington and beyond, having here with me Ambassador Daniel Fried, who is the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow of the Atlantic Council and former U.S. Sanctions Coordinator under the Obama administration, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who's Senior Fellow and Director at the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you, Andrea, for being with us today. And last but definitely not least is David Kramer, Senior Fellow at Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs at Florida International University, joining us from better weather places as always. Thank you so much for being with us here today. And with that, let me take it over to the beginning of our discussion. So let me just put it to all of you, what's your quick take on this? Is this an escalatory measure? Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Is it neutral? How do you place this new package of sanctions, expulsions in the broader trajectory of U.S.-Russia relations? So Dan, let me start with you. And if you want to talk a little bit about the sanctions piece, I think that'd be very helpful.
It's a solid step. The new executive order brings together a lot of strands of Putin's malign behavior. And it says this is a problem for the United States. So it is a coherent statement of Biden administration resistance to Putin's aggression. That's solid work. And I also like the fact that it comes after the Biden administration has made it clear that we can cooperate with Russia where we have common interests, like on nuclear arms control. So the Biden administration has already avoided traps of its predecessors of being all angry or all reset. Neither works. You have to be able to do two things at the same time and not tie yourself into knots agonizing about it. The other point to make is that there are some new, stronger sanction steps. The move against Russian sovereign debt is something I had pushed for when I was sanctions coordinator for the Obama administration. Didn't get it, they did. Finally, buried in there, in the executive order, is a provision authorizing sanctions if the Russians use energy as a strategic weapon in Europe or the Caucasus. That's important for Nord Stream 2. There's a lot in this package. Finally, though, it leaves a tremendous amount of escalatory headroom. If Putin attacks Ukraine, which he may, we have a lot of options. And this package doesn't exhaust those options. It makes it clear that we could escalate. So I give the Biden administration some pretty good marks for it.
Ambassador Fried, thank you for that quick assessment. There's a lot to unpack there. We'll go back to some of the issues you raised. But Andrea, let me take it over to you. What is your assessment of this new package?
I'm with Dan. I also think it's a really strong step from the Biden administration, and I say that for a couple of reasons. I think they've accomplished a lot with this important step. So first, a lot of the sanctions that have been implemented are designed to disrupt Russian actions. So the sanctions on cyber companies, on the Prigozhin-linked actors, these are all efforts by this administration to try to disrupt what Russia is doing rather than just using them in a more punitive manner. I also think, as Dan said, it sets up a really important deterrent for future Russian actions. This new executive order essentially lays out what the Biden administration's priorities are. It's a very clear signal of what's important to this administration. And it now gives the administration a lot of new capabilities and tools to be able to take future actions if Russia doesn't adjust or modify its behavior. And then finally, I think it helps give this administration a whole lot of credibility. So that the sanctions on Russian sovereign debt demonstrate that this administration is willing to go there. But as Dan said, it's still at the lower end of what they could do. So it does leave a lot of headroom for where they could go. So again, agree with Dan, and for all those reasons, it's a really solid step.
Great, thank you, Andrea. David, let me take it to you. You know, you've heard agreement here from Ambassador Fried and from Dr. Kendall-Taylor. You know, what's your take on this new package?
It's a good second step, and I say second step because the first step was taken last month, sanctioning a number of Russian officials involved in the poisoning and arrest of Alexei Navalny. This is a much bigger step than the first one that they took, and I do welcome it. I wish there had been some more familiar names that were targeted on the Treasury list for sanctions. There are still a number of people in Putin's circle who should be already on the sanctions list. From the previous administration to the current administration, they should have been sanctioned already. But overall, I think it's good. It's good that it ties together a number of different issues: election interference, cyber attacks, violation of other countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. There's reference in there that they also were responding to the reports about bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan, but taking that through different channels. So that suggests to me that there's actually even more than meets the eye in this package that was released today, at least the public eye, that is. So overall, good step, as long as they're prepared to take more steps. And I think Dan is right that they are likely to do so. And I think it offsets some concern that had been voiced after the White House statement that came out on Tuesday about the phone call between President Biden and President Putin talking about a summit. Some people interpreted that as going soft. I think today's action indicates that the Biden administration and President Biden himself are prepared to get tough when needed. And I think, unfortunately, it's going to be needed a lot more than not.
Well, thank you, David. We're definitely going to get to this question about the summit and what could be the agenda now that we've seen this package come out. I think you're right that the initial response to the announcement of the potential summit was, you know, this is a soft approach to Russia from the administration, but now we've seen it's been paired with these punitive measures. So I want to dig into the sanctions piece a little bit more, Dan, with you. I think what's interesting here is that it's a package deal, but it's a package deal that is staggered to have very specific responses to very specific activities, right? So we have one set of policy actions and sanctions against the interference in the elections. We have another one for the SolarWinds cyber operation, and we have a third one for the Afghan bounties program the Russians were running. But as a whole deal, you know, we have a few dozen, I think, extra sanctions against Russian individuals and entities. Do you think this will actually have an impact in Moscow? And what I mean by that is, haven't the Russians done a pretty good job, you know, kind of buffering themselves against these kinds of sanctions? And is this really going to change their decision calculus at this point?
That's a serious question. And this is how I answer it. The trouble with writing policy memos is that the results usually don't bear, their policy doesn't bear fruit in the timeline you've laid out in your memo to the president or the secretary. That is, these steps put additional layers of pressure on Putin. And the message to Russians generally is, Putin is taking your country down a narrowing, darkening path. We've been down this road before in the later Soviet period. That doesn't mean that Putin's going to surrender. If you think that this set of sanctions is going to get Putin to reverse, do a 180, you're dreaming. But the cumulative effect of pressure over time, if we're working with our allies, and if pressure isn't the only thing we're doing, can be strong. I'd rather have our problems than Putin's, even though our problems are deep, because Putin is dealing. He's at the head of a fundamentally illegitimate regime, massively corrupt, not delivering for its people, and unable to fix itself. We've got a lot of problems in America, but we can fix ourselves. We can fix ourselves. And the Biden administration is trying to do it. Putin can't, because to reform their system would be to undo the fundamentals of Putinism. So pressure in this context means that Putin is seen as leading Russia in a bad direction.
Mhm.
And we have to be patient and steady and consistent and not get impatient or greedy. Easier said than done, I know.
Thank you, Dan. Andrea, let me take it back over to you. There's a lot more here than just the sanctions. I mean, that's an important and a large part of this new package, but there's also expulsions as well. There's the new executive order that will have implications going forward. I think that gives expansive authorities to the president to do more on other malign activities, including the energy piece that Dan mentioned. But I think what's also interesting, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, is that some of these actions are being taken seemingly unilaterally by the United States, with support from European allies, but not necessarily fully coordinated, meaning that the Europeans and other allies are not matching all of the sanctions, and certainly not the expulsions as well. How do you make sense of that? The administration said they really want to work with allies and partners, but here we see some unilateral action as well.
Yeah, I mean, this administration has really said all of the right things when it comes to the importance of allies and partners in our competition with Russia and also China. And I think this is an administration that views Russia policy as deeply embedded and intertwined in our Europe policy. And so these conversations are happening. And I know that the thrust of the policy will be to coordinate with allies when we can. But I think there's also an understanding that generating that consensus and coherence can be easier said than done. And the administration then has shown its willingness to move out in a couple of directions when it can't get allies on board. But I think, with this package, there are attribution statements, and I think there's an expectation, or at least a hope, that allies will join on in some of those attribution statements on Russian cyber actions. And so there is an attempt, I think, to at least discuss with allies to bring them on board where we can, but also not letting that prohibit us from doing what we think is necessary to confront Russia. I think the one thing, one quick remark on your question about, how impactful or how effective will this be in changing Russian behavior. I think this administration recognizes fully how hard it is to change Putin's behavior in particular. And so they've been really serious about resilience, efforts to strengthen democracy at home, recognizing that domestic policy is foreign policy. And so while all these steps are designed to try to change the calculus that Putin faces, there is the realization that that is hard to do. And so in the meantime, we can also take actions to mitigate the effect of what the Kremlin is doing as well. So I think that's an important part of this larger approach that we see coming from this administration.
Thank you, Andrea. And David, you mentioned the Putin summit. I know we're going to get to that as well. I'm sure others will want to come in on that. What could be the agenda for that conversation between President Biden and President Putin now that we've had these punitive actions? But I think one thing that was really telling about this package is that they're not explicitly, these sanctions and other moves by the US government, they're not explicitly tied to what's happening today in Ukraine. We have this massive military buildup in Ukraine's border. We've also had, on the other hand, Alexei Navalny being arrested and jailed in Russia. But there's really no mention of any of these moves being connected to either of these two ongoing and quite concerning events. What do you think about that?
Well, your mentioning of Navalny, Alina, I was struck at how Navalny's name did not come up in the White House statement that was released on the phone call on Tuesday. And Dmitry Peskov went out of his way to say that Navalny actually did not come up at all in the conversation. That's, according to Putin's spokesman, take it for what it's worth. I do think that it is important that the administration have at the ready further, even tougher sanctions should Russia move in militarily into Ukraine. It's already there, of course. It's already invaded, but should it move this rather large force that is mobilized along the border and in Crimea, we have to move very quickly, ideally with allies, but if necessary on our own. Same thing with Navalny. If Navalny is killed, and it would be a murder, it would not be just he dies. It would be if he is killed, we need to move aggressively on that. And Putin would be responsible should Navalny die in prison. Navalny wouldn't be in prison if it weren't for Putin. So I think on both fronts, the Biden administration needs to be ready to move. President Biden invited President Putin to this virtual climate summit. Should one of these two things happen, that invitation should be rescinded. And I think it goes without saying that should either of those two things happen, the idea of a summit between President Biden and President Putin should be completely off the table.
Well, thank you, David. Personally, I tend to agree with you, and I hope this signals a step towards a potential escalation if Russian behavior doesn't change, and part of our more strategic approach to the U.S.-Russia relationship. So let me just wrap it up with a final question for all of you. This summit or the meeting between Putin and President Biden, if it does happen, what do you think should be on that agenda, given what we've seen today, just given the low point in the U.S.-Russia relationship more broadly, the Russia's seemingly unabated desire to continue to target the United States and our allies? What can we really get done at this point with Russia? So what is the purpose of the summit, and are there some concrete things that you would suggest should be on that agenda? So I think I will go with in slightly different order. So Andrea, let me go to you.
Great. So I'll start by saying I think the summit was a good idea. I know a lot of people viewed that as being soft on Putin, but this is an administration that doesn't view diplomacy as a reward for behavior, but an opportunity to deliver hard messages. And Biden has demonstrated in his calls that he is fully capable of delivering those difficult messages. I also think it had a strategic purpose in giving some kind of strategic pause in the Ukraine situation. I mean, I would say obviously the Ukraine situation is very much about Russia, Ukraine, Minsk, getting them making progress on Minsk. But I think there is an element of it that Moscow feels the United States, the Biden administration, is underestimating and overlooking Russia. And this kind of gives Putin the recognition maybe that he craves, but in a way that can encourage more constructive behavior, like I said, by giving this strategic pause. So I thought that was a very smart and wise move. And I think there's a number of things they can address in the summit. It's a very narrow list of things. But I think generally the areas that this administration would be looking for engagement is first and foremost on strategic stability. That was at the top of the list of the most recent phone call. The New START adds a lot of credibility, gives that foundation for those future strategic stability dialogues. Afghanistan, with the drawdown, we need to be engaging Moscow and help with other regional partners to help create a stable settlement in Afghanistan. Iran is another one, and Arctic, as Russia takes over the Arctic Council. So the list is narrow, and I think we should be very modest in our expectations about what it will produce. But at least the two leaders are sitting down, having that line of communication. And that's another thing that this administration is very mindful of doing, that we have these channels of communication so that we aren't miscalculating or making bad assumptions about each other's intentions.
Thank you, Andrea. And I hope it goes without saying that I hope at this summit, whether it happens at Helsinki or not, or some other neutral territory, third country territory, there'll be others in the room for some of these conversations, so we have a better sense of what goes said and also unsaid. Dan, let me take it over to you. What can be on this agenda? I think Andrea outlined some quite narrow options that could be discussed between US and Russia. Is there anything you would add to that?
Well, I think her analysis is spot on. Look, if the Biden administration took the position that we can't meet with Putin until their behavior improves, we'd be putting ourselves in a corner. because we might not want to or be able to hold that position. And then we would look like we were doing a climb down. But as it is, Biden made the offer of a summit meeting with Putin on our terms, right as we're hitting them. I thought that was very clever, actually. We need to be able to talk to them. But my advice for the initial summit, keep your expectations under control, okay? Don't expect too much. We're not going to charm Putin. He's not going to say, oh my God, I made such a mistake in Ukraine. We're getting out of Donbass. Not. It's going to be a difficult meeting, but he needs to know that we are willing to work with Russia, but that we will respond strongly, consistently to Putin's aggression. And once you get the posturing out of the way, and the posturing will come from Putin, I'm sure, you can accomplish some things. Set up channels for discussion, make sure they know what our concerns are, make clear what our red lines are, and mean it. And then try to make progress. And Andrea outlined the positive agenda and did it well. So yeah, go ahead, meet with Putin, but no reset buttons this time. No, exaggerated expectations. No discovering the inner liberal in Putin. Yes, but President Biden is not going to make those mistakes. He just won't. He's been around the block with these guys.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. The low expectation setting, I think, is key there. But it's still unclear what beyond reestablishing some dialogue on some issues where the U.S. and Russia have concerns about non-mutual interest. That's really top of the agenda, and also signals how what a bad place we are in the relationship today. That this is what we think we can maybe accomplish with the Russians today. So, David, you have the last word. What about anything else that you think the summit could potentially accomplish?
Well, I think it would be a boring webinar if all three of us agreed on this, and I'm not going to disagree just for the sake of disagreement, but because I actually disagree with both Andrea and Dan. I commend President Biden for getting the New START extension done very quickly in his first week in office. I think that was very smart to do because now Putin can't hold that hostage over us. But President Biden, a few weeks ago, in response to a question by George Stephanopoulos, rightly, in my view, said, yes, Putin is a killer. It's a little hard for me to see President Biden, the president of the United States, now sitting down and having a summit with a killer, somebody he has described as a killer. I don't think a summit with President Putin is necessary or wise at this point. And so I would hope that there is a rethink on that. Things can get done in lower channels. It is getting done at lower channels. We have an effective ambassador in Moscow and John Sullivan, who seems to be staying on for the time being, which is good. And we have other ways of communicating with Russian counterparts. Unless President Biden is prepared during a joint news conference, standing next to President Putin to reiterate his answer to the question, do you consider President Putin a killer? Then I would say, don't go meet with him.
Well, thank you, David. That's why we have you here, to disagree with people. One idea maybe could be to do a summit with President Zelensky before President Biden meets with Putin. That would certainly send a strong message to the Russians where U.S. priorities are.
A trip to Kiev, either by President Biden or Secretary Blinken very soon, would be a great signal to send. Absolutely.
That actually is something we did in the Bush administration. That is, when President Bush went out for a VE Day trip to Moscow, he started in Riga, Latvia, and he ended up in Georgia. And the point was, we will work with the Russians. We will commemorate a holiday that's important to the Russian people, right? But we will also remember the other side of that equation.
Absolutely.
The victims.
And a holiday that's important to Ukrainians, Belarusians, everyone in the region.
Exactly.
And we can do both. And, sitting down with a killer, look, David's got a point. He's got a point. But my answer would be this. By framing up, when I read the White House readout of the phone call, I smiled to myself and I thought, right, they're framing it up so the summit takes place on our terms. not Putin's. That was smartly done. And I had nothing to do with it. It's not self-serving. I just sort of like the high degree of skill. Administrations usually take a couple of years and a bunch of stumbles to get there. This administration hasn't lost its touch.
It should have mentioned Navalny, however, Dan.
Yes,
That was
yes, I agree with you. Yes,
omission.
yes. You're right. Absolutely right about that. Yes,
Yeah.
I agree.
I think we can all probably agree to that as well. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, David, Andrea, Dan, for joining us. This has been a CEPA rapid response to U.S. policy on Russia, with the new administration unrolling a new set of Russia sanctions, expulsions, and other measures to impose some consequences on the Kremlin's malign behavior in the past. Bit of taking care of unfinished business, perhaps, and looking forward to seeing what the administration will be doing on Russia in the year and years ahead. Follow us on social media at CEPA on Twitter, on LinkedIn. We are now there too, Facebook and elsewhere. Thanks everyone for watching. I'm Alina Polyakova. Thank you for being with us today. And thank you to my wonderful panelists.